There we go.
Okay, good morning, Professor Tootle.
Morning.
So I have this recurring, it's happened for years, watching friends and strangers, not foes necessarily alike, say there ought to be a law. You know, and it's because we see something in our life, some clerk treats us poorly or a neighbor is obnoxious, see on the news and go, I can't believe that. I'm calling my city council person or state legislator or congressperson, but they usually don't boil it down to that. There ought to be a law. I can't believe that that's going on. And there's other examples like that where people just want to have problems solved as soon as it happens, they want it fixed so they can like move on to their picnic or something. And it seems like it's gotten a lot worse in the last decades. I don't know. When I was a kid, it didn't seem like we had to regulate everything all the time. And so there's also a combination of maybe that we're all citizen journalists now with our phones, and somebody says something rude to somebody else and we have to post it because maybe it will go viral and we can all shame them into better behavior. Or maybe we're famous because we caught some jerk doing some jerky thing. I don't particularly have an agenda today, except that I bet you're going to be able to give us some insights into human nature or American history, the relationship between citizen and state, or government and population, that maybe can just make us feel a little better, that it's not as bad as I sometimes think it is. Or maybe how we can all be more effective when we do think there's some atrocity going on in the world, instead of just like shouting at Facebook or calling a congressman and yelling at him. That's the big broad topic. Do you have a reaction to that there ought to be a law? Is that any of the same feelings as me?
Well, I sort of have a contemporary reaction to it, but then as you were asking me about the kind of history side of it, I was thinking about how fortunate we are. And I guess maybe this will involve a little bit of a mea culpa. Have you ever heard of Frederick Jackson Turner? Is that
No.
Or the Frontier Thesis? Have you ever heard of something called the Frontier Thesis?
That sounds interesting, though.
It's this. It was a speech given by this historian named Frederick Jackson Turner in 1890 after the closing of the frontier. And the mea culpa part of this is it's something that I used to make fun of. And I used to make fun of it and say, oh, the Frontier Thesis, what a dumb thing, because when I first learned it, I didn't actually read it for myself. I was taught that it was a sort of statement of environmental determinism, that somehow America was shaped by having a frontier. And I flippantly heard a joke from a smart person that I just repeated for years. And it's a good example of how you can get by with being sarcastic and flippant also. Good. And the joke was, well, Russia has a frontier and South Africa has a frontier. They don't have liberty, and it's a good enough joke. And it does illustrate that having the mere presence of a frontier doesn't not necessarily make you a free people. But once I actually read the Frontier Thesis, I thought, I'm giving short shrift to this really important idea that has to do with the unfolding of law in America. And his argument wasn't that we were necessarily, that having a frontier leads to liberty. His argument was that, that what a frontier did was it allowed our civilization to continue to start over. And so that it meant that this new group of citizens would be going out into this entirely new place and starting over and applying the laws all over again. And I sort of explain it to my students this way. If somebody were to tell you, here's $300,000, remodel your house, you would probably not change the footprint of your house. You would make improvements. Now, what if somebody said, here's a bunch of free land, build a new house? The house that you would build from scratch would be different than the remodeling. And what the frontier experience did for us as Americans is, Boston has been remodeling. So we have the older Eastern cities and Eastern legal traditions that are essentially adding on to an existing legal tradition. But what the frontier allowed us to do is say to ourselves, if we were starting all over, how would we do this? And there's almost no way to recreate this other than bringing the idea of ordered liberty to an entirely new place and saying, how would we construct this if we were to build this up from scratch with nothing but the Constitution to guide us? And so it was a tremendous blessing that we had to watch, this unfold, because as soon as the new states would come in, the new territories would come in, they would be arguing in a sense with the old states. And then that legal tradition would also, benefit the unfolding of, ordered liberty. So you end up with things like women being able to vote, for instance, is a good example. An innovation of the West that became an experiment and spread the other direction. So when I think about the law, my mind also goes back to the Puritans, because people often think that that Puritans always wanted the law to regulate human behavior. But one of the first important politicians in America was John Winthrop. He's the guy who gave the model of Christian charity speech or sermon that's often considered kind of the founding document of American intellectual history. But anyway, when he was governor of Massachusetts, of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, he was constantly reminding people that who wanted normal behavior regulated and laws. He was constantly saying, no, we don't want the government doing this, because we want churches regulating the behavior of our people. So one of the things that might be perhaps shocking to people to know is that when you think of Puritan Massachusetts, you might think of a place with very restrictive laws on personal behavior, when in fact there were almost no laws restricting personal behavior in Puritan Massachusetts. Those rules were all enforced by churches. And so it was your local church that would be, making rules for their own church members, which were often all the people who lived in the village. Anyway, the other thing, sorry, I'm going on a long rant here. The other thing that my mind thinks about is the difference between passing a law to punish bad behavior and then regulating behavior of regular people. We often don't make the distinction between laws that are designed to, regulate the behavior of someone who's, has no interest in being a bad person, versus doing something that is antisocial. And then I guess the final question that I often pose to people is, I want them to think about what they believe the purpose of the justice system is. And all of these things are fruitful for discussion. And I think when people get across one another and start arguing, those are the kinds of questions I like to ask to try to get at the root of what this person is actually advocating. Is this something that you're saying you believe that we as a collective have decided that we want everyone in society to act this way? And we want to impose that on people at the state, the city, the county, the state, the national level, and sort of, where do you get off? Like where, or is this something that we're doing that is, and another thing, I guess, just to bring up something that is often controversial, making something that is already illegal more illegal doesn't actually do anything. So I am constantly, it seems like the thing that I'm confronted with the most is people believe in sort of therapeutic law, which is making something illegal actually changes society. But as we've seen so many times, first of all, almost no laws get, there's a selective enforcement. There has to be, because we've passed so many laws. And when, so I think I was, I was listening to something about, people who lie on federal firearms forms, which is, I think I heard yesterday that there were less than 250 prosecutions for that nationwide last year. And it doesn't matter what laws you pass if you don't enforce any of them. So I guess any of these things are, I think, fruitful for conversation. Thinking about how law unfolded in the American experience is always interesting. Thinking about what the purpose of law is, thinking about what laws are supposed to do, the difference between regulation and punishment, and then the lack of enforcement. And I'm happy to talk about any of those.
Love that. Well, let me ask a couple of random ones that tie in, and you can answer it anyway. And then Jeremy and Tony and Ben, you can jump in as well. So Professor, what is it in the human nature? And is this a new change when something horrible happens in Texas, or in a horrible way, or something almost silly in Florida? There's always some Florida man doing something that's outrageous. And we have to listen to the 24-hour news cable and say, and somebody's sponsoring, or what does the president think about a local flood or a riot? And the governor, or they're talking to the mayor or the superintendent of schools or something, and they go, well, the president's calling me. But I guess most of my instinct is, why does the president, I'm sure he cares as a human, and I'm willing to watch it as a citizen viewer too. It is newsworthy, I guess. But what are we going to do about it? Why do we all have to be involved in everybody's business at all times, it seems like? And maybe that's just the modern media now, that it makes it seem like something is happening to our next door neighbor when it's really thousands of miles away. Do you have some gut reaction, or is the human brain changing? Are we all becoming more liberal and want federalized? Do we want a McDonald's in every state? When we want a hamburger, do we have to have the same thing in every place? Is it just the natural evolution of human beings, or what's going on?
Well, part of it is, there's a part that's central to just the human experience, which is when something terrible happens, our instinct is we want somebody to do something. And the other thing that we want is an explanation. And one of the hardest things for a human to really wrap their heads around is tragedy. Everybody who has lived has experienced tragedy. And every time something really horrible happens to you or someone who you love, our brain wants an explanation. We want to try to make sense of it. And I'm sure that for you and for everybody who's watching, your mind immediately casts back to something horrible that happened to you or someone who you love, and you want it to make sense. And it's one of the struggles of the human condition to be a part of this world, while at the same time saying, I can't understand. How do I deal with the fact that I can't understand that this is happening? And so it's completely natural for us to want some kind of an explanation. What has changed over the last 110-ish years is, because of the growth of the administrative state, the federal government is just a part of our lives. And so when we grasp for answers or solutions, we turn more naturally to this thing that for the last 100 years we've been told is the place where you should look for answers. And we go back to, my mind then goes back to all of those debates that took place around the progressive era. And, William Howard Taft sort of said, this is what's going to happen. He did a pretty good job of predicting what would happen when we began to look to the government to solve problems that cannot be solved. You will always be unsatisfied with the response. I guess if somebody wants the sort of flip side of this, because if you're somebody who's loves the administrative state and thinks Woodrow Wilson is amazing, I'll turn the analogy the other way and say the reason why separation of church and state has been good for religion is that politics is ugly and it is messy and it never works and it never does the thing that you want it to do. And one of the reasons why separation of church and state was good for religion is that your religion didn't get mixed up in that imperfect human dirty, messy, power politics, corrupt mess. And if you understand that concept when it comes to the corrupting influence of politics on religion, maybe you could turn that lens and say, well, trying to get the federal government to solve problems is going to lead to the same kind of frustration. And instead, I think, I always return back to Lincoln, which is the first thing to ask yourself is this something I can do myself? And then start asking yourself, and that doesn't mean that we all have to be rugged individualists, but then the next thing is it something that I can do with my family or with my friends or with my neighbors? And that, how can we solve this problem in the simplest, quietest, cheapest way possible? Without necessarily imposing, tearing down my neighbor's fence and kicking down his door and making him change how he lives his life.
So, Professor, you've given a ton of handholds to have discussions on. So thank you for this. In fact, I'm going to listen to it again to have topics for new shows. Here's the theme, though, that I'm curious about and interested in to get your perspective. When evil befalls society, yes, the local law enforcement or local fire department or local elected officials and media and neighbors, the people it directly impacts and the people that can be helpers in that impact, that all makes sense to me. What doesn't make sense, and all the variety of topics that we've had over the last year and a half, abortion and guns and gays and war and the multitude of complex issues, it doesn't make sense to me that people are hoping that someone else way far away is going to solve the problem, that the president or some executive agency or some investigative branch of Congress. It seems like we're instantaneously going to the highest, most remote level of government to try to solve some local issue. And to me, that seems counterintuitive. It doesn't even matter. The current liberal conservative thing just doesn't make sense. I'm just talking about as a human being. Unless we're injured, me or my neighbor, my family, the rest of us aren't victims. We're the helpers. But it seems like we all instantaneously think we're victims and must have a universal solution to that horrible issue. And I mean, even business horrible issues. I'm not talking about, pestilence and drought and murder. I'm just talking about the normal things of life. We want someone else to solve the problem. And yes, often an unelected court. I do have conservative bias. It's not even or maybe even common law. I don't know. It just seems like we have an incredibly complex system, and we're trying to make it more complex every day, thinking that's going to solve it. Is there a historical answer to that frustration?
Well, I guess I'll just confess that this is an issue where I might be a complete hypocrite because I just haven't worked out exactly what my own beliefs are on this, because I haven't yet been able to find a good rule to follow in this next concept I'm going to throw out there, which is the idea of your vote as a moral imprimatur, that what the law is and what it represents is, when you vote for a politician, to what extent, and I'm asking this as a question because I don't know the answer to this, to what extent, this is honestly something I've struggled with because I've never really found an adequate answer. To what extent am I granting them, am I saying that by voting for this person, I approve of their actions? Is there some piece of my morality that I am transferring to this other person? And to what extent should the law be a reflection of my personal beliefs versus, when I'm voting or when I'm saying what should be done, how much authority should I grant, and what does that mean? I'm asking it as a question just because it's something that I don't know the answer to.
Well, you should just follow my lead. I generally vote for them the first time, and then they do enough things that make me mad. I vote against them the second time. So I give them some authority or a leash, and then I pull the leash back in. How's that for a practical way to?
Well, I mean, I know that and this gets back to another thing I always worry about me being a hypocrite on, which is I say that I believe in this system of ordered liberty and I want other people to live their own lives and be free. But at the same time, that is in and of itself a value system that I am saying I believe that you should live under a system of classical liberal values, because that is what is best for humanity over the long term. And I am actually imposing that system on others because I genuinely believe it is not just the system that's best for me, it is the system that's best for you.
But there are a ton of people, right, Professor, that actually don't value that as much as safety and security. They would rather have an autocrat or a dictator who keeps them safe, and at least they have some standard of living and some predictability with their life. They don't have to make those moral decisions and dilemmas of how to deal with each other. They just the benevolent king or the monarch or the dictator or the military junta or whoever is protecting them. And they live a good life because they're protected. There's a lot of people that like that.
Well, and it's the role of the statesman or the elite to constantly remind people of the costs. And if you're somebody who says, oh, I'm doing this because I believe in, I want what's best for my safety and my security, I would remind that person that what's actually best for your safety and security is the system of ordered liberty under classical liberalism. In fact, that reminds me of something else that came up in a completely unrelated topic, which is when people ask about whether or not Americans favor legislation, when you present something as is this something you want? Americans will overwhelmingly always say, I want this benefit. But when pollsters say what the cost will be, those same polls will then change. And so one of the things that I think politicians often do, because it's in their interest to do so, is they ignore the second part, which is relaying what the cost is. why do we have high inflation right now? It's of course everybody votes for let's give ourselves more money, and let's get rid of free trade. We've essentially had now 3 presidents in a row who don't like the idea of free trade, but nobody stopped to explain that one of the things that free trade does is it drives down prices. And everybody says, "Oh, I want higher wages." So what are we doing? Everybody says they like free money. But you can't just say, "Oh, we're not going to have free trade, and we're not going to have, and we're going to give out free money, and we're going to have higher wages, and there will be no cost to it." But at the same time, if you explain to most Americans, "Oh, by the way, I know that we like free money and high wages, and we hate free trade. Would you be willing to get rid of those things in exchange for 10% inflation?" Watch what would happen to those poll numbers. Ask that question now. And I know this seems far afield from a discussion of law, but the point that I'm trying to get to is that laws are created by politicians. And laws are created by politicians because they think they are themselves struggling with this question of what is the law supposed to do? Am I supposed to represent what is best for the people who I was sent here by, or am I to do what I think is best for them, even if they disagree? And I haven't found the proper balance for this. Maybe I just haven't read enough books, but I guess my only solution is I just kind of muddle through and do the best I can each day. But that's not a super satisfying philosophical answer for us.
I think there's one thing that I think about with all of this, and this goes back to your idea of when something tragic happens, you're trying to respond in a rational way to something that's completely irrational. And so you're trying to take control of it. And that's kind of a natural emotional response. But the cynic in me says that at some point there's this outrage, and then there's this political opportunism that takes over. And, I think I've heard it attributed to Churchill, but it's been attributed to any number of people. Never let a good tragedy go to waste. And has there been a time where that seemed to ramp up over history, where our lawmakers were kind of waiting for that outrage for their opportunity to advance their agenda or something like that?
Sure. I mean, but sometimes, and as historians, we try to judge these things by, is this sophistry or is it statesmanship? Because, Abraham Lincoln was somebody who was waiting for events to unfold until there was political will to make things possible in order to advance, human freedom. Franklin Roosevelt, I mean, one of the things that was from 1930 to 1932, Democrats wouldn't pass any bills, and the Depression kept getting worse for 2 years, and it was deliberate. And when Franklin Roosevelt came in, one of the reasons he could engage in the 100 days, legislation is it had all been written. They said that there was all waiting for him to come in and be elected so that the crisis would get worse so that they could enact this political agenda. Some of which was good and some of which led to a crippling decade-long depression that was, we're the only country that didn't recover from the Depression. So before World War II. So, and I remember this incident with John Kennedy, where they had passed some, liberals were excited at the thought of what social science could accomplish in government. And, now that we now think we can capture data and use it quickly enough that we can actually make poverty go away. This was a big idea in the early 60s that, eventually led to war on poverty stuff.
Mhm.
So there was a pilot program in, I think it was West Virginia or someplace like that. And I think it was someplace in Appalachia. And they got the first data back, and they take it to Kennedy and say, well, it's not working. And Kennedy says, cancel the program. And everybody around it says, hold on, we just won that district for the first time. Who cares if it works or not? The people there like it. And the program continued, because every time you start a new program, it creates its own constituency without any sort of natural ending point. It creates its own, if you don't have to use the word dependency, you can just use the word incentive. I mean, it creates a financial incentive for it to continue. So there's always that tendency. And then the same, so as far as morally condemning it, we tend to only morally condemn it when it's something we disagree with. And otherwise we say, oh no, this is actually just shrewd statesmanship.
Does it feel like, to you and everybody else, I guess, like in the post 9/11 era, we've enacted a lot of laws and made a lot of legal change in the heat of the moment, in that temporary insanity of fear and grief and reaction, more so than we did prior to that?
That's a good question. Probably, but I think it's because of how much society had changed in terms of what they expected from the federal government. I mean, as somebody who just went through a bunch of airports, you just can't overstate how much theater, completely unnecessary theater takes place in travel. And I'm reminded of this every time I leave California and go to another state. Going to a concert in California versus going to a concert in Colorado, and which is what I did when I was there. And the person I was traveling with said, "Wait a minute, they just let us, and they just let us be free here," and the answer is yes. And unless you have that as a contrast nearby, when you live in California, and if you never leave, you don't realize, because you're in this sea of regulation everywhere you go, you don't realize that you can actually get rid of all that stuff and people will be fine for the most part. You don't actually have to live your entire life according to how the worst human being, something that the worst human being did 30 years ago. You don't actually have to change your entire society from top to bottom.
So how do you recreate that frontier, like of the frontier thesis? It's, and as you were describing that, I think of it in a different way. I think of it as a fishing net. So I get a tangle in my line. Some of them I can untie. Some of them, it's just a giant bird's nest of stuff, and I've got to cut it out and start over. So I think of things like healthcare reform. I don't know how you untie that knot. I think of some of the Homeland Security stuff. How do you begin to untie those knots?
Well,
so how do you rediscover these frontiers so you go back?
I got some good news for you and some bad news.
Yeah.
That the way the system works is slowly. And if you think about how freedom was able to overtake slavery, really what happened was that freedom works better than slavery. And so you didn't have to pass laws, or you just had to say, we're not going to have slavery in this place. And where do you think everybody went? And then, so what ended up happening in every place that didn't have slavery? That's the place where you had economic growth. That's where you had political growth. That's where you had immigration. That's where you had innovation and all these things. But, every single year, contrasting the economy with the South with the economy of the North, it was just the North was exploding and the South was just sort of limping along. And so you fast forward over a 50-year period and you realize this area of the country is rich and this area of the country is decrepit and poor. If you want a more modern example of this, think of the industrial North. What they had to do was they had to collapse. It has to, and people who are smart and thoughtful and innovative leave.
Mm-hmm.
And then this state collapses and this state grows. And then eventually the state where everything collapsed looks over and says, why is Tennessee now where all cars are produced? Tennessee and North Carolina and Texas, why is everybody moving to, I shouldn't say everybody because we still have, a lot of, but why are people going to the states that are dynamic? And what kind of people go there? And fast forward 50 years. And what you'll see is whoever has the freest place is going to be more successful 50 years from now. So I guess my short term, or the bad news is you have to wait 50 years.
No, that makes sense. It does.
Brilliant questions, Jeremy. Tony or Ben, do you want to jump in? Not yet? Cool. Professor, I've got two more thrusts, or at least one more that I'd like some reaction to that are different than what you've talked about already. So too much information for today. Would you rather have a congressional, and from a historical approach, what's better for the society, the free market or the frontier or the over-regulatory state? Is it better to have Congress write detailed laws, or is it better to just have some broad brush stroke that they write and the executive branch agencies have to flush all the regulatory law out, same power, same penalties, same result? Or is it better to not even do it at all and let an unelected branch of government, the judiciary, write laws that either increase or decrease freedom? What's the example throughout American history, contrasting with other countries? What's better, the people's houses, the executive branch agency, or the courts?
Well, I would say it depends. And these things tend to be most effective over the long term when the federal government is focused on doing things that only the federal government can do. So your Arapahoe County should not be building an aircraft carrier. And there are things that only the federal government can do. And when they tend to focus on those things, like building world-class interstate highways, thinking about where to put ports, where to put bridges, and thinking about these things on a national level, because there will be times when somebody says, well, we've got a bunch of rich people who live in this harbor area and they all have really expensive homes, and the federal government needs to come in and say, well, there needs to be a port there during wartime. And that's something that only the federal government can do. Or it's best for the nation as a whole to do this kind of stuff. Environmental law is the same way, which is something that it really does need to be legislated at the national level.
Because of water and air pollution.
Right, because these things cross over state boundaries. And not only that, but they cross over international borders, and it becomes a part of treaty obligations that only the Senate can handle. So all of that stuff is best handled through the legislative branch at whatever the appropriate level is. So again, over the long term, it's best when legislatures legislate, but that means federal government legislating in areas where only the federal government
So you answered both questions. It's better to have legislators create policy and the executive branch implement it, not to have to write all the policy because it's too vague.
And I'll also say better, not perfect. You know, I'm making no other claim other than it's better than most alternatives most of the time.
Okay. Last main thrust that I have for today is a corollary to all this. Is where do we get better data? It seems like the interweb is just full of crap and everybody's opinion. And it takes a pretty good skill set now to be winnowing out information, not finding information. Heck, the information is at our fingertips, but it's just the wrong information. Can you give some insights or how do you approach finding facts? Like if there ought to be a law, well, how do we start investigating? I assume some other states already tried it, or some municipality or county, or maybe another country. But is there some set of data points that you can at least steer us to so we make better arguments for our specific causes when we say there ought to be a law?
Well, I'm going to give you a perfect example by demonstrating something that you did earlier today and showing how important what I'm about to say is, which is we don't just need better data, we need better context. Earlier in the conversation, you made fun of Florida man, right? Something crazy happening in Florida. But I don't know if you know why we think Florida has crazy people. And the reason is that Florida, unlike almost every other state, they have these sunshine laws for state and local government that requires that they publish all of their public information, including criminal cases at the local level, in a way that is easy to be understood. And
you're kidding. That's why we know all this crazy stuff about Florida, man.
Right. So because it is easy for media outlets to find weird stories about bizarre criminal behavior in Florida and in no other state, we think that people in Florida are crazy. So the data itself is leading us to believe something because we have the data, it's just not in the right context. The context of that data is that Florida has better sunshine laws. And what we should really
I love that story.
Is have sunshine laws in all the other 49 states.
Yeah, we need crazy Colorado people, and we already know California is crazy, but we need more Colorado crazy.
Yeah.
John, I'll add one more thing to your question from a journalist perspective. One thing you're taught as a reporter, like from day one, make sure the information you're getting from somebody is part of vetting a source. Make sure that source is in a position to know the information they're telling you. Otherwise, are you getting an opinion or are you getting an informed fact from somebody who really knows the background? And, we're going through so many legal questions right now. I've gravitated to a podcast that's got a couple of former U.S. attorneys talking about it from a legal perspective. You get away from the spin, you get a little bit more insight into the law, and that helps decipher the headlines and whatnot, because those are credible sources, as opposed to, you look at, even people in Congress, they don't understand the legal ramifications of how the system works a lot of times. I saw a clip yesterday, a House rep was talking about the Roe decision. And he was reacting to something that Jordan had said. And in refuting it, he said, so are we going to live by these laws that the Supreme Court just made? And it was just a little error, but I thought, dude, you're the guy who makes the laws. The court doesn't make the law.
Right.
But that little, they were focusing on the outrage of his comment and not the factual substance of what he was saying. So you got to be careful of that.
And the other there's absolutely no substitute for long-term expertise when it comes to the law or in politics or journalism.
Oh, yeah.
One of the things that we're really lacking right now is, there are only a handful of journalistic outlets that who have the resources well, I shouldn't say that. They all actually have the resources, but they just choose not to use them this way, because we're talking about giant media conglomerates and
No, we're
hiring,
not. We're not actually. We're not.
well, hiring 10 reporters would be a rounding error
Yeah.
to most of these entities.
Mhm.
But the way that they choose to allocate their resources is not to have somebody cover just the Department of Education, because that's boring.
Yeah.
But every time a story comes up involving the Department of Education, what would be really valuable is if you had some journalist there who knew how to put that information into context when it came out and say, oh, wait, hold on, fellas. Like, and what would be even better is if you had 5 different reporters, all with 20 years of experience covering just the Department of Education. And we as readers could say, wow, all these people with this deep, deep wells of institutional knowledge, we could benefit from that conversation. And in a way, we have something closer to that in the law, where I think I benefit from listening to people who are actual experts in constitutional law. But what I find is that they all sound pretty smart to me. So I can't really just listen to one, because what I really benefit from is hearing a conversation between 3 of them over here and then another 3 of them over here. And then, and you sort of realize that there's a common set of facts that they all agree upon and a common set of contextual, I don't know, things you can hold on to. But you realize where they disagree is so different from where the national conversation really is. But normal people can't be expected to do this as part of regular life.
Yeah.
Like being an informed citizen, it just can't be your full-time job.
Right.
It should be something that you spend between 10 and 30 minutes a week on.
John posted that question the other day. How much time should you spend on this? And, I'm thinking about these specific podcasts and things, but I drifted off into Sunday morning talk shows the other day. And so, John, I'm revising my answer to about 45 seconds at the top end.
45 seconds.
Is how much you should spend on those prime time.
Oh my gosh, you're both painting the political science degree.
Right.
I really think the average American needs an hour a day. And that includes reading the newspaper, watching the news, talking to politicians, talking to your neighbors. It includes, you should think about society 1 out of 24 hours a day.
I think you do, but you've got to find really good sources to do that. Not that easy to find, low hanging fruit.
I think it's even more important to have more than having. I think more Americans should have face-to-face contact with their elected officials.
Yeah,
and outside of public forums too.
Right. You call them up and go, hey, by the way, I have some interest in. Have you ever thought about? And listen and talk. Yep.
Yeah, and I think that when I say civic engagement, I don't mean reading the Wall Street. I read the Wall Street Journal, and I even get the paper edition of the Wall Street Journal, right? When I say civic engagement, I mean that you should elect people who because they are volunteering at this organization that you also volunteer at, and I think it's more important for citizens to be a part of their communities than it is to try to break down every recent Supreme Court decision, because when you do that as a non-expert, you're going to take things out of context. I mean, that's what I struggle with all the time, right? Because I think I told you I actually do read I try to read as many Supreme Court decisions as I can in order to have a better context for all of them. But at the same time, if you look at what I'm also trying to read a history of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and
also trying to read your papers.
It's hard, and what I'm really doing is grading papers all day. I'm in the middle of summer school right now, and you want to know what my day looks like? when I turn this off is I'm answering student emails and grading papers. And that's my actual job and I have to do it, you know? So most people have real lives and jobs and kids and sick family members and, you know.
And they should remember that too, and not just sit there and watch CNN or Fox News all day thinking they're doing something.
Yeah, smoking pipe with their elbow patches as they, you know, contemplate the mysteries of life and governance. You know, that's not how people live their lives. You know, there'd be no time for riding motorcycles.
Context is the other thing too, that, you know, kind of why we're doing this is to provide some understanding of it. Is, you know, you read a news story or you watch a news story on TV, it tells you what happened today or yesterday. You read a book about that subject, it starts 60 years ago or 100 years ago or something like that. And it gives you this buildup so that you really understand what's going on. And it takes that kind of perspective. So I think you need to balance both of those. You need to look at the Wall Street Journal for your day-to-day notes, but you've got to build some foundation underneath that in the history of what those subjects are. So
well, that's why, you know, I always said, like, you know, everybody should read like Land of Hope. You know, it's a good general history of the United States written by a non-crazy person. And, you know, like if you want to know what every sort of educated American should know about America, you don't have to read 30 books, but you should know everything that's in that one, because that's the kind of like, you know, basic history of the United States, you know. Now, if you want 10 more after that, I can give you 10 more after that. If you want 100 more after that, I can. But, you know, I think it's not unreasonable to expect, you know, especially people who went to high school, to have a kind of basic understanding of how the government's supposed to function. I don't think that's unreasonable for people to ask.
That might be a good way to finish our show. Jeremy, Tony, or Ben, do you have any last remarks or questions?
I have maybe it's a remark, maybe it's a question. It has something to do with, like, so these, you know, less than direct news sources that seem to just proliferate. I guess my question is, what's generating that? There's got to be some demand for that, right? And so that's my kind of big concern about it. It's like, yeah, Fox keeps doing what it's doing, CNN keeps doing what it's doing, you know, because people love it or are watching or something, right? There's got to be some metric that they're looking at. And so I wonder about that, you know, what are some of the root causes? Is it that people are just tired, overworked, you know, like they want to just sit down and not do anything for a period of time, and that's how they passively consume their information, and that information is not necessarily rigorous, you know? So I think about that, you know, and I certainly would appreciate any perspectives we might have on that, you know, especially Jeremy, since kind of that's your world, the world of media, and, you know, certainly Professor Tootle, your perspective on why you think that, why is there such a proliferation of this? Like, it's like ad TV. It's none of it is content driven. I mean, it is content driven, but none of it is driven by, hey, let's get at the facts anymore. You know,
I think it's a very long conversation we could have about it, but the short answer is the news business, they always talk about it as a news business, but from the beginning of time, really, it's been an advertising business. That's what supported it. And that ad model broke. It broke a long time ago. And so now that ad model, that business model doesn't cast the same wide net of general information. They're trying to engage people in different ways. So the metrics that they're looking at really aren't driven by getting to the facts and getting to deep understanding. It's to getting eyeballs right now, tonight versus tomorrow night, versus the top half of the hour versus the bottom half of the hour versus, you know, and it's about getting advertisers placed in different places. So they need to look at the metrics differently. The news never made the ad model, never really generated revenue for media organizations. It was, you had to get the Washington Post and you read about the Watergate break-in because the Washington Post was your internet of that time. It was how you understood the world around you. That doesn't exist anymore. There are too many competing things coming in. So what you see in cable news and in some media, they're struggling with that broken business model.
Thanks, Jeremy.
I guess I have two thoughts on it, just really fast. One is think about what kind of movie gets greenlit, which is a sequel. It's always easy to get somebody. You're not going to lose. People are scared of losing their jobs. Everybody who has a job is scared of losing their job. And if you do what somebody else has done, fail, there's less of a chance that you're going to lose your job. And if everybody else is saying this is how we do ad buying, and this is what creates clicks and eyeballs and all this stuff, you say, well, that just becomes this avalanche of where the money flows. And it took forever, actually, and I was shocked at how long it took for instance, people to begin advertising on podcasts, because it's the last captive audience that anyone has. These are the only ads that anybody watches anymore are YouTube and podcasts. So I'm always confused as to why anybody is advertising anywhere else. But at the same time, the stranger thing is that we've experienced both we're in the middle of the bursting of the media and education bubbles. And the media has begun rebuilding itself. The education system has not. And we are in the early days of the rebuilding. Where I live in California, what's really happening is that, the bigger media outlets that owned and were making money off of this older model and still are, essentially bled the rock dry. They killed the host. But we have this regulation in California that says that legal notices have to be printed, and they have to be printed in the county where they originate. I don't know if other states have this. And so what we've seen is that essentially legal notices become the thing that funds local news. And then subscriptions, and then they're building a more successful business model, because then the advertisers come back. But you have your base of legal notices, then you add subscriptions, then you add advertising, and then you can build your newsroom based around, a financial model that doesn't have some sort of giant corporation sucking all the money out of it. And
you just described the last 6 years of my career.
Okay.
Yeah.
But so, that's what I mean.
was,
This is happening everywhere, right? So,
and I'll tell you that inside the Colorado Press Association, because I worked on this committee, I was on the legislative committee with dealing with legal notices in Colorado. We had the same thing. And our lobbyist came to the board and said, okay, your legal notices are okay right now, but I got to tell you, it's getting harder and harder to make this intellectual argument that it needs to be in the newspaper. You guys need to wean yourself off of this subsidy, and you've got to find a way to do it. And, in the newspaper world, going through the period of it that I did, they called it, the way to the future was you had to train yourself to step over print dollars to get to digital dimes. In other words, you had to see that there was some potential in digital, but it's not going to pay what print is. So you've got this sexy amount of money over here that's going to help you meet your month so that you're not getting chewed on by corporate and your creditors and whatnot. So you put your focus on protecting that at the expense of these digital dimes over here that they just let slip away for so long. It was a hard thing to watch, but that's change in business. It's difficult.
So there are three three or four entities that I often point to. One is the Dispatch, which I mention all the time. This idea of we're going to actually build a good newsroom from the ground up based on subscribers. So national subscribers we're going to have be national in scope and be focused on generating original news. And then you have the sort of Politico, which it has the two tiers of, the sort of free version that they give out, but they also have Politico Pro, which, the subscription to Politico Pro is something like 15 grand or something like that. Like, it's really expensive. And the only people who pay for it are, people who really need to have that level of insight into whatever it is that Politico, Pro reporter covers. But at the same time, it means that they have that institutional knowledge. So, they have somebody who just covers tax policy just in Congress, so that when there is a big story, there is a reporter there who is an actual expert in the subject. So media outlets are experimenting with this model, and we'll see. And and I'll also mention like Barry Weiss, who's somebody who I read and listen to. I don't know if you guys are familiar with her, but she's fantastic. And she seems to be building her own innovative media model as well. And so there are a lot of different directions this could take that are all interesting to me. Well, but I wish education was doing the same thing.
Jeremy, I applaud you that you absconded with the topic. We were talking about should there be a law? There ought to be a law, and we ended up talking media policy and history of media. So good at you. A worthy topic all to its own. Tony, we may want to change the topic to to include both. I was very insightful. This is exactly what I wanted to have happen.
Well,
I've got to go today, gentlemen. Any last words that we should have talked about that we didn't? Last bite at the apple. Ben, Tony, Jeremy's, Professor Tootle.
I'm good.
Okay. Very much appreciate your time. There's going to be a couple of other topics that came out of this, Professor. That was insightful at the beginning. So thank you for bringing up those things for us to ponder until we do a show on them. So have a great day, you all. Thanks for your time.